Hello, and welcome to Darkest of the North. Have you ever heard of the forum known as Flashback? Unless you live in Sweden, or in one of the neighboring Nordic countries, then you most likely have not ever heard of it. And the reason for that is because Flashback is a Swedish website, and exclusively for a Swedish-speaking-only demographic. The forum was founded in 1996, but it wasn't until the year 2000 that it really took shape. Until this day, it is one of Sweden's most visited websites. Flashback covers various topics from cars and sports, animals, politics, to criminal cases, and much more. Another topic in particular that can be found are scary stories. From made up to supposed true experiences that people have had. In this video in particular, I have translated 6 scary stories from a ghost story thread created around the year 2002. All of these stories were shared between 2002 and 2005. So, sit back, grab a warm drink, and let's begin. This is 6 Ghost Stories from Flashback. Number 1. Written by username Snapcase. A few years ago, when I was active in the Scouts, I worked as an assistant in a patrol scout department. We were staying in a wonderful old large shack that was built in the year 1900. It was originally intended to be a cow stable, but apparently the builder thought the frame was too stable, so it became a residential building instead. Appearance-wise, I would say that the building looked remarkably like the house in the Amityville Horror. Downstairs was bright and nice, but the upstairs consisted mostly of a huge corridor with no windows. Now, regarding the night I want to tell you about, I was sent upstairs to grab some buckets. The Scouts were going to play a game that consisted of spinning around, hand in hand, around a stack of plastic buckets, and it was my job to fix the props. I knew this house inside and out. I had my own key, and my friends and I spent a lot of time there. It was sometimes a strange atmosphere there, though, especially when you were alone. But it didn't bother us too much. Anyway, I went upstairs and tried to turn on the lights. Only the light at the end of the corridor was lit, though, to which I thought, whatever, as I knew either way, everything was, for I had arranged all the supplies myself. I walked up to the correct cupboard and started taking out the buckets when I suddenly felt my hair stand up. Someone was behind me. I turned around and saw the silhouette of a man walking towards me from the other side of the corridor. At first, I froze. Then I dropped everything and ran away to the stairs. When I came down, I felt pale, but didn't want to show any emotion in front of the kids. That might upset them. And instead, I walked over and whispered to the manager that I wasn't feeling well and needed to talk. When I told her what had happened, she called her husband, who came and checked the whole house. It was empty, of course. This was probably 15 years ago, but I still shuddered while writing about it. Number 2. Written by username Agent Cooper as a response to the first story. Oh hell no, gave me cold shivers. I myself had an experience with something ghostly. When I was about 13, I spent a summer in my grandmother and grandfather's summer house way up in Lapland. The summer house was more of a cabin, small and cramped. Right next to it was a lake surrounded by forest and high mountains. I also want to add that their cabin was the only one at this lake and also lacked electricity and a telephone. It was only the three of us, me, my grandmother, and my grandfather, who were there. Or so we thought. One late night, around midnight, my grandfather and I rowed out on the lake to lay fishing nets, while my grandmother was snuggled up in bed sleeping. In addition, this was in August, when it finally started to get dark up in the north. It was chilly, and the light mist laid over the lake in the pitch-black darkness. There was not a single sound. We rowed out quite a distance from the cabin and the small sandy beach the boat is usually docked by to lay the fishing nets. I rowed while sitting turned towards the shore, while my grandfather sat facing it as he put the nets in the water. We were both very quiet, enjoying the total silence of the night. Suddenly, the silence was broken by my grandfather saying, "Who the hell is that, standing by the cabin?" I was taken aback at first, but when it finally registered what he had said, I gasped and turned around. Below the cabin, standing on the beach, I saw a person who looked to be completely dressed in black. The person stood completely still, seemingly looking towards us. Based on the form of the person, both my grandfather and I knew that it wasn't grandmother. My grandfather whistled to get the person's attention before yelling out in his thick Norlandic dialect, "Who are you?" But the person did not let out a single sound in return. My grandfather whistled and shouted at them again to get an answer, but to no avail. At this point, I was really freaking out, given that this was pure wilderness and the nearest neighbor lived a few miles away, so it was very unlikely to be someone we knew. And so, my grandfather ordered me to row as fast as I could back to shore. Without ever once looking back, I rowed like a madman. Once on land, I turned around to see the person, but there was nobody there. Without a word, my grandfather had already run up to the cabin to see if the person had entered, for we hadn't locked the door. And living so far out, it was something we never did. I ran after. We found nobody, though, besides grandmother, who was in bed, sound asleep. Trying to seem and sound casual, my grandfather looked at me and said, "We will fix the nets tomorrow. Good night." Scared as a hare, I went to my room and laid in bed. After a sleepless night, I tried talking to my grandfather about last night's occurrence, but he kind of didn't want to speak of it. In fact, he didn't say a single word about it. My grandmother later told me about something similar happening to him as a child, and that is why he doesn't want to talk about it. But for my own part, it was the most disturbing thing I had ever experienced. I also looked for footprints on the beach, but did not find a single one besides our own. Number 3. Written by username Zeromatic. Ugh, it's hard to sleep now reading this. I'll probably pop some popcorn and watch TV to wash away the eerie thoughts. But first, probably mention this in another forum at some point. In a book with ghost stories from the 90s, it says that in the basement of Gävle Castle, there is a mysterious pool of blood on the floor. It is said to have appeared there when a girl was murdered or executed. The city's old prison is next to the castle, where in the past they executed people. Anywho, it is said that the more you try to wash away the girl's bloodstain, the bigger it gets. I've been there in that castle though, checked the whole floor, and found no pool of blood. Anyhow, I also wanted to share about some of the ghostly events my family and I have witnessed. I have a sister who is 3 years older. Barely a year after I was born, my grandfather died. He was extremely fond of my sister, and before he passed, while on his deathbed, he recorded a tape for her where he mixed music and talking. I got to listen to the tape a couple of years ago. He was mumbling and slurring his words a lot, so you couldn't quite understand a single thing he was saying. Though I am thinking about studying it a little more closely, as I think he might have said something interesting. Why? Well, long a time ago, before his death, while he laid in bed in his bedroom, he complained, saying, "There's gas coming out of the walls." Later, the house was found to be full of radioactive noble gas known as radon. One night, my parents woke up to a crash. My dad got up and checked what it was. A photo frame containing a photograph of my sister had tumbled off its hook in the living room and smashed to pieces. The photo had hung there without ever moving for the last 2 years. A few minutes later, the phone rang. It was from the hospital. They announced that our grandfather had just passed away, and he was in the hospital in Gothenburg, about 50 miles away south of the city of Gävle, where we lived. Number 4. Written by username Trick. I was in the middle of nowhere while walking home on a late and dark night. While crossing a large lawn, I looked up and saw a woman in a wedding dress hanging from a noose. She was hanging there with her neck so eerily bent. It was as if it was broken. She was maybe 10 to 15 meters away from me. I gasped and felt my heart beating in my chest, but I stayed put, out of fright as well as curiosity. There was a vague shimmer around her, and I could make out the details on her dress rather decently. Though once I was able to bring myself to continue approaching her, she craned her neck, raising her arms and head to the sky as she slowly started to spin around. By then, I began thinking to myself, like, that can't be right. I'm a bit too old to believe in ghosts. In any case, this had been going on for a little while, so I began rubbing my eyes, hoping that it was nothing more than a hallucination. But it was not. When I looked back up, I saw that she had turned her head, and she was looking right at me. She began to glow brighter and brighter until the outlines disappeared and the light began to fade until nothing remained. It is not uncommon to see some weird things when you take a quick glance to the side and it just turns out to be a tree branch or something. But where I was and saw this woman, it was nothing but a flat, long stretch of grass. To this day, I still have no idea what it was I saw, but rather than being scared, I honestly found it interesting. Number 5. Written by username Wittgenstein. I might as well share the same story I posted in a different ghost story thread. I have been involved in several shady things. The creepiest thing, though, was when I was 13 years old. I was alone in an old crofter's cabin in the middle of the darkest Småland. I was downstairs, sitting and reading by the fire, when suddenly I heard someone walking around upstairs, and that the door to a chamber opened. I got up to check who had come home. I didn't think back then that there was only one staircase that went up there. Of course, it was completely empty. There was no rat, no gust of wind making sounds. But I know what I heard. But of course, people can think what they want about ghosts. Another story, of which I have only second-hand information from, is one my ex-girlfriend told me. She had a childhood friend whose family bought a nice old house a little further away from civilization. Every time she visited, she was creeped out by the many things moving in the periphery when upstairs. Dark shadows drifted past in the corner of her eyes, but when looking towards it, it would disappear. The couple who lived in the house had a son, who by then was around 5 or 6 years old. One day, my ex took note that the child was sitting alone upstairs, engaged in a conversation with what she thought were imaginary friends. She went downstairs and told the others that she thought it was sweet that the boy had found a pretend friend. What the parents said after that was not as sweet. That apparently he could not only describe in detail the appearance of these imaginary friends, but he also knew their names. And these imaginary friends were exact descriptions of the people who had previously lived in the house, but were now dead. Number 6. Written by username Visionaire. Interesting reading everything people have shared here. I personally haven't had any ghost encounters, and I would consider myself as relatively hard to persuade when it comes to things like this. However, a friend of mine claims with utmost certainty that things have happened around him, and he has not been able to explain. One night, about 2 years ago, he called me. While trying to catch his breath, he said that from now on, he would not be in the garage at night. As he is very involved in motorsports, he basically spends all of his free time screwing apart and reassembling cars of all kinds. This evening in particular, he was working on his rally car and had done something stupid to get the car started. It was leaking gas and the charging wouldn't work, so he had to take the utility vehicle, a Mercedes, to jumpstart it before he went to bed. The garage in question is adjacent to the house, and the house itself is quite remote with forest and water nearby. It was almost 1:30 before the rally car was ready for one last attempt to get it going. He had driven the Mercedes up right across from the rally so he could easily lean over to connect the starter cables. As he stood face down in the engine, he swears that he felt a sudden pat on his behind. The sudden touch made him flinch as it was all quiet and dark around him. And with it being so late, there couldn't be anyone coming by for a cup of coffee. With adrenaline-filled veins, he ran out into the yard and shouted, "Hello?" But no one answered. He convinced himself that it must have been his imagination, and so he gathered himself to finish the car. When he got into the rally and was about to try and start it, suddenly the headlights on the Mercedes turned on, flashing him in the face. "That's it!" he screamed and jumped out of the car to catch the supposed bastard in the act. Because he was being flashed right in the face, he was unable to see anyone behind the wheel of the car. However, when he ran over and yanked the door open to see who was there, he was greeted by an empty driver's seat. Upon this realization, he turned around and ran as fast as hell out of there, deciding that he was done for the day. He was visibly shaken when he called me, and he is not the kind of guy who tells lies or has a need to make things up. This has got me thinking. Even though I consider myself a non-believer when it comes to ghosts and other things, my friend thinks that maybe it was someone who wanted to warn him. Like that the garage was filled with petrol fumes. There may also be a logical explanation for what happened, but it is difficult to convince my friend of this. But who the hell knows? And that was 6 scary stories from Flashback. Which one did you think was the most creepy? And let me know if you want me to translate and share more of these for future videos. Thank you for watching.